your parents switched jobs and you had to move to another town, probably one of the first questions that you would ask is, where are we going to live? NASA engineers and architects are already hard at work designing a practical colony that will sustain life for a year on Mars. And they have to consider what people in coal camps did: how to collect water, provide heat, prepare and store food, and how to keep as clean as possible. Just like people on a Mars crew will be concerned with data management and an area to store their records, I kept a daily journal of my trip so I could pass on accurate information upon my return. Weather and climate are important issues in determining what kind of habitat will be needed. Our weather and climate are rather temperate, and the coal camp houses were built for these conditions. But on Mars, it's a whole different situation. A typical weather report might predict, in Fahrenheit, temperatures as low as 122 degrees below zero, with a high of 22 degrees below zero. Now that's pretty cold. And there are severe dust storms, sometimes bad enough to block out all sunlight for a while. So any domes or other habitation structures will need to be very durable. The heating systems will also need to be very efficient, and ones that are carefully planned out. Now, Jim, speaking of the weather on Mars, what is our report for Mars today?
Well, the weather on Mars today will be quite typical. I predict a temperature as low as negative 41 degrees Fahrenheit.
On my journey, the climate and the weather were not as harsh as on Mars, but of course, some of our conditions were still quite uncomfortable. On March 26, 1750, for example, when we set up camp for the night, we definitely had to build a fire to stay warm. We traveled much of the day in thunder, lightning, and rain, and it was chilly. The next day it began to snow, and it kept snowing until around noon. And what made it difficult was finding enough wood that was dry enough to get a fire started. But I'm not complaining. We managed, and remember, when I began the trip through the Cumberland Gap, I picked 5 of the bravest pioneers that I knew to travel with me. And miners have to be brave too, and have many challenges in their environment.
You're right. Surface miners have to endure some of the same conditions you did, but the climate in an underground coal mine is quite predictable. The year-round temperature is 52 to 55 degrees. You can be pretty sure that an underground miner doesn't go to work in T-shirt. Now, Mars vehicles will also have to be prepared for dust storms and the rough terrain.
Well, Jim, don't the rovers up there now need the sunlight in order to generate power to operate and keep warm?
In the summer of 2007, the rovers were subjected to severe dust storms and they had to shut down or hibernate until the storms were over.
Of course, colonists on Mars will probably be able to bring their vehicles into some kind of shelter. Maybe a small dome garage. Who knows?
Who knows?
Sometimes people go from one area of the country to another area for a period of time because they want a change in the weather. Would anyone like to share an example of this?
My grandma and grandpa always go to Florida during the winter because they like the warmer weather. And that's okay because we get to spend Christmas with them and I get to go to the beach.
That's cool.
No, actually kind of warm.
Good one.
Now let's consider this same idea with a slightly different question. Does anyone know of someone who has moved because they want a change of climate?
Kind of. My brother got a job with the Parks and Recreation Department in Sedona, Arizona, and he says he really likes it there.
Why does he like it there?
I guess it's because his asthma is better there, because it's a mild and comfortable climate.
Good example, a mild and comfortable climate. Children, what do you think that means?
Not too hot, not too cold, just right.
Alex, that sounds like what Goldilocks said about Baby Bear's porridge. But anyway, do you suppose that the climate is a determining factor in what types of houses are being built?
Yeah, pretty much.
Sure.
Well, what about on Mars?
Sure, and you probably can't use the tent up there anyway.
One of the things that engineers and scientists are currently working on is what type of materials would provide the best protection from the harsh climate on Mars.
I wish I could help with that project.
Well, architects and engineers are already working on designs for greenhouse-type domes and other structures for the Mars colony.
You mean like the Astrodome or the Georgia Dome?
Yes, exactly. And domes would also be good for hydroponic gardens and the living quarters. Students, what about houses in coal camps? How do you think they were heated?
Coal camp houses? Coal, maybe?
What about wood?
Both of you are correct, coal and wood. By the way, two things that won't be used on Mars.
How will Mars colonists get heat?
There's still a lot of debate over how this task will be accomplished, and it's a problem that the space engineers are currently working on. There may be possible use of solar power in combination with mirrors to reflect and concentrate energy, or devices that work with small controlled bursts of nuclear energy.
Miss Rowe, I have a question.
What is it?
Well, if we have refrigerators here on Earth, will the Mars colonists have them too?
Good question. And we know that with any perishable foods, they will have to have some type of refrigeration system. Probably like what we use.
I saw a picture that was taken back in 1915 of some coal miners with their buckets. My grandpa said that those were their lunch buckets. Do you think that the people on Mars will have to take their lunches with them to work?
Well, I think colonists will have to have some type of nourishment, won't they? However, they probably won't carry their meals in buckets like what you saw in the picture. But children, you can see that there's going to be numerous things that they will have to deal with when living on Mars.
And we haven't even mentioned bathrooms yet.
Good point. Another area of concern when talking about waste products.
Oh yes, bathrooms. Bathrooms in coal camps were outhouses behind the house, and sometimes people using them had to share them with bugs, spiders, and quite often snakes. And can you imagine how unpleasant it was using it on a cold winter night? And for a Mars colony, design engineers are already working on the problems associated with human waste disposal. Now, you talk of going into town, but for people living in coal camps, that was town. There were no shopping malls or plazas, and if someone wanted something, they had to go to the company store. Now, clothes were usually made by hand, although a family might be able to save up enough to order something special from the mail order catalog. I guess that was their version of online shopping. Now, coal camp houses were simple, usually 4 rooms with no running water or indoor plumbing. The heat came from fire in a cook stove or a pot-belly stove if a miner could afford one. There are other things to consider with habitation, too. At coal camps everywhere, a large wash tub was what people took their baths in. And after the water was heated on a cook stove, then all the kids used the same water. Now, brushing teeth was done with baking soda, and bad breath was cured by gargling with salt water.
Class, if products are used down in the mines like detonators and explosives, what do you suppose the miners can do with the empty containers once they are finished with them?
I suppose they might just leave them there.
Possibly, but what if it's directly in the path that they are working in?
They might just throw them away.
Sure. Does your mother ever ask you to clean your room?
All the time.
Why do you think she asked you to do that?
So I won't be living in a pig pen?
In other words, she wants you to do something with your trash and waste products.
My mom says that you have to do something with your garbage.
On Mars, trash can't be garbage. It will have to be recycled for another use. But recycling's not a new concept. It has actually been around for quite a while. In early coal camps, supplies and money were limited, so a young child wore clothes that had been outgrown by his or her older siblings, and after the hand-me-down clothes were worn out beyond repair, they were recycled again, the women cutting them into small patches and using them to make a patchwork quilt. Another concern with habitation will be health maintenance and exercise. Now, coal miners got what you could call their health exercise just in the course of their normal work days. And children back then played outside a lot more than children generally do nowadays. But on Mars, it will be important for colonists to exercise a couple hours a day due to the gravitational differences.